Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk to you about the growth dilemma. And I want to dive straight in. 3 facts, simple but really remarkable, have defined the entire economic history of human beings until now. The first is that for most of the 300,000 years that human beings have been around, economic life was essentially stagnant. So whether you were a hunter-gatherer slaving away in the Stone Age or a laborer working away at the start of the Industrial Revolution, although your lives would have differed in lots of different respects, fundamentally, from an economic point of view, it would have been the same. A brutal, relentless struggle for subsistence. The second economic fact is that this stagnation only very, very recently came to an end. Modern economic growth that is significant and sustained, is an incredibly recent phenomenon. And the third economic fact is that somehow we have managed to maintain this economic ascent. So whenever growth had happened in previous centuries, it had quickly fizzled out. But this time it was both significant and sustained, as if some long pent-up productive power had finally been unleashed. Now, as time has passed, we've used this extraordinary material prosperity to achieve remarkable things, freeing billions from the struggle for subsistence that haunted our ancestors, making the average human life far longer, far healthier than ever before, funding discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, splitting the atom, cracking the genetic code, starting to explore the stars. But this pursuit of prosperity has come at an enormous price. The destruction of the natural environment, the desolation of particular local cultures and communities, the emergence of vast inequalities between those who have a share of this enormous wealth and those who do not, the creation of technologies like artificial intelligence and the pursuit of those technologies, their effects on work and society, it's not clear yet that we can properly control. And so growth presents us with a dilemma. On the one hand, it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. But on the other hand, it's associated with many of the greatest challenges that we face today as well. It feels like we're pulled in 2 opposite directions simultaneously. And I want to explore this dilemma in more detail today. And I want to do 3 things in particular. The first is, I want to say a little bit about the history of economic growth. How did it come to be that we were societies that chased so ferociously after economic growth? The second is I want to say a little bit more about the mysterious causes of economic growth. My starting point this afternoon is that if growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe for many of the reasons that we heard before, but we also need to pursue a different type of growth as well. And I want to share some thoughts on how all of us might do that in practice. So that's the plan, and again, I want to dive straight in. So first, the history. Now, what's really interesting about the idea of economic growth is that although it sits at the center of our common lives today, it's an incredibly recent phenomenon. Before the 1950s, almost no politicians, no policymakers, no economists, nobody is talking about the idea of economic growth. And that's what this Google Ngram shows. The phrase economic growth is barely mentioned in print publications before 1950. Now, the thing that changes that is World War II. A basic challenge when you're fighting a war is answering the question, how much of the economy can we slice up and dedicate to the war effort, and how much do we need to keep at home for civilian needs? And what was really troubling, really unsettling for British policymakers in the Second World War was that they did not have an answer to that question. there was no reliable way of knowing how large the economy was, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. And that only changes with the work of John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist who was asked to step in and devise a calculation to measure the size of the economy, one that at the end of the 20th century would become known as gross domestic product, or GDP. But this is only the first part in the story. Gross domestic product is how big our economy is, but growth is about relentlessly pursuing ever more of that GDP, ever increasing the size of the economic pie. So how did growth become such a priority? Well, the answer to that again lies in war, albeit war of a different type. When the hot war of the Second World War comes to an end and the Cold War begins, many of the measures that we might have traditionally used to tell who was winning the war were not available. Things like soldiers killed, territory won and lost, weapons destroyed. And so in the Cold War, what becomes a kind of proxy measure of who is winning this war between the United States and the Soviet Union is whose economy is growing faster. So in the 1960s, you have President John F. Kennedy coming forward and saying, growth is the thing that will determine or help shift those who sit, I quote, on the razor's edge of decision to choose between us, capitalism, and the communist system. Growth, said Nikita Khrushchev, is the battering ram with which we will smash the capitalist system. So it was war, first hot, then cold, that put growth in its pole policy-making position. And what happens as the 20th century unfolds and the demands of growth fall away as this growthmanship between the US and the Soviet Union becomes less important, it turns out that growth is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. And so growth sort of stubbornly remains behind as a policy priority. And the starting point for me this afternoon is that we desperately need more growth. Around the world, economies are creaking, and if growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe for that very reason, because growth is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. But what's fascinating about the idea of growth is that although today politicians, policymakers, often economists, talk very confidently about the idea of economic growth, we know surprisingly little about the causes of economic growth. It, in fact, remains one of the great mysteries, one of the great puzzles of modern economic thought. Having said that, I do think there is one lesson that all of us can draw out of the fog of uncertainty about what causes economic growth, and it's this, which is that more growth comes in the end from more technological progress, and more technological progress comes from discovering more ideas about the world, more creative, inventive, ingenious ideas. Now, this story of what causes growth is very important. And it's very important for two reasons. The first is this, which is that understanding that growth comes from discovering new ideas about the world is an important counter, an important correction to what I think are some of the great misunderstandings about economic growth. So it's very common today, for instance, to hear something along these sorts of lines, that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. You hear it a lot, particularly in the environmental movement. And in fact, this is a big mistake. Infinite growth is possible on a finite planet. And the reason why infinite economic growth is possible on a finite planet, the reason why many people disbelieve that, find it hard to believe that, I think is rooted in a misconception about what causes economic growth. The problem with that idea of a finite planet is that it's rooted in a very old-fashioned view of economic activity, a time when our economies were made up of farms and factories, when people could quite literally count the inputs into production, count the outputs from production. And of course, in a world like that, a world of things that we can see and touch and drop on our feet, of course, there are limits to economic growth. There's only so much land that can be farmed. There's only so much raw materials that can be used in production. But focusing on the finite nature of our physical planet misunderstands how it is that economic growth actually happens. Again, growth doesn't come from using ever more resources, more land, more materials, raw materials. Growth comes instead from discovering ever more creative, inventive, ingenious ways of using the finite resources that we have. In other words, growth comes from technological progress. So another way to put this is that growth doesn't come from the world of tangible objects, the things that we can see and touch and drop on our feet, but growth comes, again, from this intangible world of ideas. What do I mean by ideas? Well, I mean recipes or instructions for organizing the atoms in the world, or more prosaically, recipes or instructions for making use of the finite resources that we have, making ever more productive use. And the key point here, the key point for all of us thinking about the future, is that whereas the planet of those raw materials might be finite, the world of ideas is unimaginably vast. For all intents and purposes, it's as good as infinite. So just a way to really hammer this point home. Think of a cupboard in your kitchen. And imagine it's a well-stocked cupboard, so it has 300 ingredients in it. Right? There are finite ingredients in this kitchen cupboard, but there are more possible recipes for combining those ingredients than there are atoms in the universe. And it's this observation that applies not simply when we're thinking about ingredients in a cupboard, but quite literally all the atoms in the world when we're thinking about economic growth. The second reason that this story matters, though, that growth comes from technological progress and technological progress comes from discovering more ideas. The second reason that this matters is because it gives us some insight into how we might generate more growth. And I think there are 4 really important things that we ought to be doing around the world in order to drive more economic growth. The first is overhauling who owns and controls ideas, the intellectual property regime. The second is investing vastly more in research and development. We cannot expect a steady stream of new ideas about the world unless we invest in their discovery. The third is we need to get more people into the parts of the economy that are responsible for generating new ideas. And the first, and I think the final, and the most radical, is that we have to use the new technologies themselves to help us generate ideas. So let me just hone in on 2 of these in particular. First, research and development. So here are countries around the world with their research and development expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product. At the vanguard, at the front, you have Israel investing about 5.4% of its GDP each year in research and development. You then have the United States lagging well behind. You have the OECD country on average managing barely half of that. And then you have my home country, the United Kingdom, even further behind. Again, you cannot expect a steady stream of new ideas about the world, new technological discoveries and economic growth unless you invest seriously in their discovery. And many countries around the world just simply aren't doing that. The other one I wanted to focus on, though, is the idea that we might use these technologies themselves to help us generate new ideas. And I think this is the most exciting, but also the most unsettling possibility. In the 20th century, many of us got used to the idea that the best ideas we have about the world come from the heads of smart human beings. I think in the 21st century, the best ideas we have about the world are going to come increasingly from our technologies instead. And a country's prosperity will depend far more on its willingness to invest in these increasingly capable technologies, and particularly artificial intelligence, which is one of the great interests of mine. So, I think we could catch a glimpse of what this looked like during the pandemic. Moderna used artificial intelligence to develop one of the earliest vaccines. But I think the most striking example of it was more recent when AlphaFold, an AI system owned by DeepMind, now owned by Google, solved the protein folding problem in biology. I won't go into this in too much detail, but the observation I would make is that this discovery alone, in fact it was AlphaFold 2, This discovery alone was enough to warrant the Nobel Prize in chemistry for the system's designer, a man called Demis Hassabis, and some co-authors. Just step back. Essentially, an AI system won a Nobel Prize. This, I think, is a glimpse of what we are going to see far more of in years to come. The best ideas about the world are going to come from our technologies and not from us, and we have to be ready as a society, it seems to me, for that. But we cannot simply plow on in the pursuit of more growth alone. If we were to do that, it would be to neglect the tremendous harms from growth that I described before. And so we've also got to pursue a different type of growth as well. And I want to just focus on one dimension of the price of economic growth to show you what this looks like. And it's the one most commonly associated with economic growth, that we are growing our way towards a climate catastrophe. And I want to take you back to 2007, when the Stern Review was published. And it was the first report of its kind into the economics of climate change, a huge 700-page document. And one of the central conclusions of this report was that if we wanted to reduce emissions by 80%, we would have to pay a price of 1% of GDP per year. In other words, there was a serious trade-off between growth and the climate. We have to pay a high price in order to protect the climate. The following year, Nicholas Stern, the report's author, came forward and said, no, I made a big mistake. Climate change is worse than I feared. In fact, it's going to cost us 2% of GDP per year. The trade-off had got worse. Fast forward, though, to the year 2020 and look at the work of the UK Climate Change Committee. So the team of experts tasked with advising the British government on climate change. One of the central conclusions of their report was that if we wanted to eliminate emissions, so not simply reduce them by 80%, but completely eliminate them, it would cost just 0.5% of GDP per year. In other words, the trade-off between growth and the climate had dramatically improved. We have to pay a far lower price today in terms of economic growth in order to protect the climate. And the big question is why? Why did that happen? And the answer is that 3 decades, essentially, of changes in taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms and cultures just completely transformed the incentive that all of us face in society. So we are incentivized not simply to develop new technologies, which, as I said, is the stuff that drives economic growth, but to develop particular types of technologies, namely those that do less damage to the environment, green technologies. And so what we had was not simply a technological revolution, but a green technological revolution. And the great example of this, it seems to me, is the progress that we've made in renewable energy. Back in the 1970s, solar energy in particular, that's the one that's really striking, it's a tool of last resort. If you want to generate electricity in outer space or in an isolated lighthouse, you use an expensive solar panel. But what we've seen subsequently is an exponential collapse in the price of generating electricity via solar and an exponential uptake in its use around the world as well. Solar panels are plastered on roofs everywhere you look. And the consequence of that has been that over the last couple of decades, we have seen more and more countries continue to grow while at the same time reducing their emissions. And so the lesson for me in all of this is that we should not underestimate the power of incentives to change the sorts of technologies that we develop in society. We have the power, if we want, to develop technologies that make us more prosperous, yes, but also develop technologies that not only don't destroy the environment, but don't widen inequality in society, that don't undermine the availability of good work, that don't threaten how well our political system functions, that don't disrupt the sorts of thriving local places and communities on which we all rely. And that is a central theme of my work at the moment, how we might redirect technological progress so we can become more prosperous, but also at the same time protect these other things that we value and care about. And I suppose in closing, I want to give you a metaphor for thinking about what it is that I've just described. And I think when many of us, politicians, policymakers, business leaders, ordinary folk, think about technological progress, the picture that they have in mind is that we are like a train driver sitting in a train. and we can push forward on the throttle and go faster, or pull back on the throttle and go slower. But our sort of direction of economic travel is fixed by the rails that are set down for us to trundle along. We can have more technological progress, less technological progress, but that's the only choice that we have. And I think that's the wrong metaphor. I think a far better metaphor is a nautical one. We should think of ourselves collectively as if we're at sea on a boat, and we can lift up our sails and go faster, or we can pull them down and go slower. But we have a huge amount of discretion as well over our direction of travel. Choice over not simply how much technological progress we enjoy, but also what sort of technological progress we enjoy as well. And I think this is fundamentally important for thinking about how we flourish in the decades to come. So let me just finish right now on a note of optimism. We live today in an age of anxiety where almost every day it seems like we are reminded of the existential challenges that we face and our supposed incapacity for dealing with them. But my argument today really has been that we also have an existential opportunity in front of us now as well. We have an opportunity to pay attention to all those valuable ends, those other things that we might care about in society, if not economic growth, and we can do so from a position of strength, looking into the future far more collectively prosperous and technologically capable than ever before in our 300,000-year history. We have the power, in the words of one of my favorite philosophers, a man called Derek Parfit, we have the power not just to make life good in decades to come, but to make it better in ways that we now cannot even imagine. Nothing, in my view, could be more important, and that really is what this talk this afternoon has been all about. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.